We want when people come here, this to be an overwhelming sense of home.
Because biblical Christianity at its core is relational.
If you are going to lead, you have to first be led. Hey, welcome to Led Talks with the Craigs. We're in season 4, episode number 2. I'm Craig Mosgrove.
And I'm Chad Craig.
Yeah, what a joy. Welcome to today's episode. We're excited, thrilled to be able to continue in this series in our season 4 about the top leadership skills. And so oftentimes, Pastor Chad, in our context, you hear, and not just the church world, but in any leadership context, what are some non-negotiables? Sometimes people will phrase it like, what are the top leadership competencies or top leadership skills or talents? And of course, we know we live in a world pretty much in the West where people are in so many ways deeply talented and gifted, but they don't have character. And many times in our world, we recognize that, okay, people are putting from the Christian worldview, the character in place to continue to grow and to be who God's called them to be. But then where many of them are lacking is actually growing in the skills to manage, to lead, and to cause something to move forward. And so we're just talking this season about top leadership skills. And last episode, we just talked about wise decision making and just provided kind of an outline for a framework, if you will, to make
help you work
decisions.
Through it.
Absolutely.
When you got big decisions to make.
Yeah. So today's episode, we're going to talk about another real key leadership skill, and that is how to manage conflict. Conflict is inevitable, right? I know in my early on, particularly my specific marriage, I would always hear from those that were mentoring us in marriage that marriage is not good, healthy marriage is not marriages that don't fight. It's just that they learn to fight fairly and they have good conflict managing skills. But this is a big topic because so many people have different styles of conflict and personality styles and how to approach it, and they bring to the relationship ways that they have seen conflicts handled in the past, and that can just confuse everybody. And so we're excited about sharing, and we know that if you're tuning in, one thing we all have in common is that we all have experienced conflict. So this levels the ground, right? And regardless of your family structure, if you're watching today or listening today and you're married, you're single, or you're single again, or you're part of an extended family, or you're in a small group at a church, we experience conflict on the reg, as the Gen Zers would say, right? We regularly experience conflict. And what makes it complicated, Pastor Chad, is, again, these different styles of conflict. So I just thought we'd just kind of kick off tonight just talking a little bit about the different styles of conflict. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but I just chatted a few of them down or kind of wrote a few of those down. One of those is just the peacemaker. And the peacemaker means that the thing you want most in your relationships is harmony. So whatever happens, that person's always trying to move the needle back to harmony, back to a sense of peace. And their attitude is basically, hey, if you're happy, then I'm happy. And that seems great until you begin to gloss over issues that really ought to be dealt with, right? So in our modern context, we would call these like Enneagram 9s.
Correct.
Who are unwilling to do the hard work necessary to create a good relationship. It's just get back to harmony. But can I just say, Pastor Chad, perhaps a better name for these would not be peacemakers, but peace fakers. So in so many ways,
surface peace. As long as it's on surface, there's a peace.
Right. And so in a kind of a humorous way, as we're talking about these tonight, or as we kind of work through these, maybe you can think in your mind, well, I'm married to that one, or this is my specific style. The next one I was going to talk about is the sulker.
He's trying to get more conflict stirred up to help you grow in this leadership skill.
Yes. To deal healthily with the conflict, all right? So the sulker is someone when someone close to you hurts you, you start to sulk until they figure out what they did and rectify it. And this one's hard. It's like you turn your whole house into one of those escape room games where everybody else has to figure out what they did to you, and with no help from you. And so that one can be a hard one.
Through the hints. Yeah, it's like the clue game, right?
The clue game.
Figure out.
That's right. Yeah, that one's... Then there's the stuffer. And this is the person who just constantly stuffs down the conflict and anger into their heart, and you ask them, is everything okay? Okay, and what's their response? Fine. Yeah, it's all good. I'm totally fine. And everybody can see the little text bubbles above your head that have curse words in it, right? And when you spit on grass,
the veins popping out of your neck.
when you spit on grass, it withers. But that's the stuffer. And a lot of people do stuff for long periods of time, right? Long periods of time. Then there's the litigator, Pastor Chad. Means the good arguers, and no matter whether they're in the wrong or not, they can always prove in whatever situation that in some way they're not in the wrong. And it's not that they can't admit they're not wrong. It's just that in their mind, they're legitimately never wrong, right? And so that person's a real blessing to live with. that
Real encourager.
that one's hard. And the fellow litigators that are listening today, have you figured out that yet when you win an argument at home, you don't really win anything, right? That's the challenge, is that if you win an argument in some places, there's a reward, like in the courtroom or in a situation that you really deal with at work or something, you might get some benefit. But a lot of times in the relationships that mean the most to us, a family or workplace, career, sometimes winning those arguments don't actually give us really any reward. And then finally, we have the screamers. And I don't know if anybody watching today has grown up with a screamer, but this is who a person, when something goes wrong, they just get it out at full volume as much as they can. Basically, the point proven is in symbiotic relationship with the level of volume. And I've noticed, Pastor Chad, in pastoring people, that people who come from families who were screamers always marry people who didn't. And so when you have your first fight, the one who is a screamer can't figure out why the one who isn't a screamer won't engage, and the non-screamer's looking at the screamer thinking, like, demon, you need to come out. Like, what's going on here, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we're going to do today, Pastor Chad, and in so many ways, I'm trying to use a little bit of humor, but I want us to use Jesus' half-brother, which is James, to teach us one of the most important concepts about conflict, and that when we really get it, it can fundamentally change how we engage in conflict. Because the truth of the matter is, for us to be leaders in our homes, leaders in our workplaces, leaders in our lives, we have to learn to deal in healthy ways with conflict, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, what creates the opportunity for someone to be a leader is that there is problems or there are circumstances and difficulties that other people does not naturally want to tackle or doesn't want to step up and have to tackle. So the thing about when we're talking about leadership is what allows leaders to be able to lead is situations where other people don't know how or want to deal with it. And so conflict is part of, in the sense,
problem solving
for leaders to be leaders.
Gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. And so, but in many ways, we see culturally the pendulum swings to either extreme. You got the stuffers, or you got the people that make a conflict out of everything.
Correct. Right.
Yes. And so the challenge of that is, how do we not look forward to conflict, but how are we not afraid to engage in conflict?
Correct.
Right? And so,
and hopefully if you're, whatever leadership capacity you're in, you got enough already happening where you're not looking to create more scenarios.
No need
that
to
you
manufacture
need to tackle. Correct.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's look at this in James chapter 4, and these, I don't know if we can call it this way, but some guidelines for maybe this phrase Christ-like conflict, and that probably is not used often, but how do you have Christ-like conflict? And one of the first kind of game-changing principles Pastor Chad I want to talk about comes from Jesus' half-brother James, okay? And honestly, who would know more about family conflict and strife than Jesus' own brother? Like, can you imagine growing up in the home with the Son of God as your brother? He gets out of bed in the morning with a smile on his face and fresh breath, right? Magically, his bed's made perfectly. He always does his homework, eats his vegetables without complaining. And seriously, how many times must James have heard, why can't you be more like your brother, right? Now, we don't know if Mary actually said that, but James knows what he's talking about when he's dealing with conflict, because you remember, Pastor Chad, who led the Acts 15 meeting to determine whether the Gentiles would be included in the faith? It was James. So he knows about conflict management. And here's the principle, is that intense, heated conflict usually involves idolatry in both parties. That's the point that I think James is going to say first. Intense, real heated conflict. When you have a conflict with someone, I'm not saying both parties are in the equal wrong. It's just that when a conflict gets heated to the point that it leads to a relational fracture, it usually involves idolatry. And so I want us to start verse 1. It says, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? This is James 4. That's a great question. If I were to ask the person watching today, what causes conflict or strife in your life right now? Most people would point to somebody and say, them. Oh, that's easy. They caused the conflict. They pointed a parent, or they pointed a spouse, or they pointed a coworker, or they pointed a team member, okay, or a boss or a small group member. But James says, think deeper. Look what he says. Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and don't have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. But you do not have because you do not ask. Now, the point that I wanted to kind of pull from this is that James is writing to church people. So murder here is probably metaphorical, right? Think of it as like rage or anger or willingness to destroy a relationship. And he says, what causes that? He said, your passions. There's something that you want, something you think you're entitled to. This person's keeping you from it, so you despise that person, okay? And so at this point, what creates the intensity in those situations is that you and I are not getting what we want out of that relationship. And the passions of these that are at war within us is an Old Testament allusion, Pastor Chad, that James is using to idolatry. And again, just defining an idol is something that takes the place of God in our life. So most people think, well, I'm not an idolater, because we think idolatry means like bowing down to little gold statues, and I don't have any of those. But an idol is anything in my life that takes the place of God. It's something that controls me, something that I depend on for life and happiness, something that without it, man, I would feel like life is not worth living. And James says when conflict gets heated in your heart, it's because you've determined something so important in your life that you can't function without it, and that makes you furious at the person who's not giving it to you. So notice what James says next. He says, but you do not have because you do not ask. What's he saying? The first place we should take our needs is God, not even the other person. We're to take our needs to God. The other person that we're talking about hasn't displaced God as the primary source or vehicle of meeting my needs. I take him to God. He takes this even a step further, and he says, but verse 3, some of you ask and you don't receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions, you adulterous people. Therein again, he says like adultery is like a idolater, because in adultery you're cheating on one spouse to have a relationship with another person. If I'm an idolater, I'm trying to have the needs that only God can met in another person. And he looks at these in the same way, right? But how do we get to a place, learning from James, where Jesus, of course, himself had these interpersonal conflicts? If you read the gospel, Pastor Chad, it's surprising to me that like two primary things Jesus does in the Gospels, eating and arguing. Of course, he preaches, teaches, and heals, but he's always talking to people, and he's always seems to be eating, having relationship, fellowship with people. But the point that I wanted to kind of really open up today is that conflict in Jesus' life is done from a place of internal peace, meaning the conflicts didn't spiral out of control and escalate to the way that we have these kind of relationship killing levels. And Pastor Chad, I just say just from the outset, like, I have been in church long enough that people will make statements like, well, I don't care what anybody or anybody else thinks about me. And that statement is almost as if I'm not responsible for how I interact with the other folks around me. And the scripture says the opposite. If as much as up to me, live at peaceable, in peaceable ways with other people. And so we just think, how do we engage conflict in a Christ-like way? So the first point I wanted to make is Christ-like confrontation overlooks a lot. So Pastor Chad, when you think of conflict in a marriage, conflict in a house, conflict in a church, conflict in a workplace, how can we flesh that out a little bit? That Christ-like confrontation overlooks a lot, right? Proverbs 19:11, it is to a man's glory to overlook an offense. We don't overlook offenses in modern American culture. It's like we're fishing for offenses. So let's just talk about that for a little bit. What is so powerful about choosing what hill we die on, about choosing what to engage in conflict, and then some other things we just let go? So I guess just let's flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's not something that from the beginning everybody is clear on. Meaning it does take a process of working to determine what you value to such an extent that you can't be silent on,
Mm-hmm.
and that you're going to have to be proactive to address. And then what are things that matter, but don't matter to the level that you need to confront or seek to address, and you can't overlook. And that's what makes this issue of conflict management and dealing with conflict so difficult, is because, one, you're talking about engaging with another or others, but there's so much personal work that has to be done first in order to have some of the things answered, where you are coming to the matter of conflict with some sort of inner peace, because you are clear on some of these things that we're talking about, meaning you're clear on what you value and what you determine you can live at peace with, and what you can't. And so without some of that hard work done first individually, anytime there's strife and conflict, there's already so many emotions going on that if you don't have anything settled within you, it's just very hard to get anywhere with it. And so what this means is, it's sort of deal with the beam in your own eye, and the principle of seek first the kingdom, meaning there has to be a priority of you and I individually, as followers of Jesus, growing in communion with the Lord, so that in that space we're engaging with inward sanctification and growing in the wisdom of God, so that when we're forced to be at a table of conflict, maybe in us there's a little more things settled, so that Christ can use us in that moment to move matters forward in a peaceful manner. We're talking about, in James 4, it talks about the flesh. And, you talk to many brothers and sisters in the Lord, and not so much in our context because we're very discipleship oriented and growth phases and divine design, but many followers of Jesus don't even know how to define flesh or how Scripture defines flesh. So if you don't know some of the basics of how we are viewed scripturally and by God, and how sin's affected us, and we're talking about a heated wars and battles, you're already on a losing footing to really know how to manage and move the conflict forward. But when you realize that anything you find in the world, like you said, the world's just looking for anything to be offended, you're also going to find in believers where Christ is not formed in the Lord.
Yeah, right.
Because we have flesh.
Yes.
Right? So the same flesh that the world has, believers have.
Yes.
And so unless we have learned where Christ is formed in our character and He's Lord, then the opportunities to have the same vulnerabilities of finding offense at everything and being against peace can happen in the church and amongst believers just as much. So I think there's a lot there that people's just got to be aware of.
Right. And that's the Proverbs 12:16, Pastor Chad. This is what really kind of spurred this thought in me. It says, the vexation of a fool is known at once, but the wise ignores many insults. And I thought, if you're wise, you don't have a short fuse. Fools have short fuses. Yeah. So Christ-like confrontation, if we can use that phrase, it has to overlook a lot. Think about how many dumb, stupid things Jesus heard all the time that He did not feel the need to have to correct every single time.
Correct.
Or set people straight.
Exactly. I mean, you gotta imagine.
He overlooked a lot of stupid stuff.
I mean, just think within this simple way, how the Apostle John frames it, the whole world lies under the sway of the evil one. And now you have the perfect Son of God walking on earth, and He's seeing where the enemy and flesh is everywhere, better than any of us have ever seen. And yet, He's not constantly attacking or saying, I got to deal with that.
That's the point I'm trying to get at here for our listeners, is that point of wisdom has to be laid first in conflict management, is that there has to be this sense of, and maybe let's flesh this out a little bit more. Wisdom is to know the difference, or the timing, if you will, of when to let it go and when to speak up. And that's hard for different contexts, right?
It's very difficult. It's not easy.
Yeah.
Because it's not just a one size shoe fits all. Right. It's not like, we're given just an absolute law and standard that anytime we face conflict, here's what to do. That's what makes following the Spirit and Jesus so difficult.
Yeah.
Is we do, like last episode, we do have some scriptural framework and parameters, but it's not a absolute always do this.
Yes.
There are times where you, in your own union with the Lord and out of your own willful choice of trusting the Lord, can say, you know what, I'm going to overlook this time.
Right.
And maybe last time you didn't overlook it.
Yeah.
And so it is not easy, but the point that we're making up front here today is it's something we all should understand, that we all experience, and we're in this together.
Yes.
So it's not like the conflict in your marriage or your situation is something that is so unique and distinct from our experience or our life, because conflict is conflict, and we live in a world where we're going to have it in some way, right? And so that the one encouragement there is if you're feeling down because there is so much conflict in your life, there's brothers and sisters, ourselves included, that understand the reality of conflict in life.
Right. That's right. So, in the words of the immortal theologian Kenny Rogers, he said, you got to know when to fold them and you got to know when to hold them. He said, you got to know when to walk away and when to run away. And then he said, and that's about all I got to say about that. Meaning, we have to get to a place. I often see, Pastor Chad, in our neighborhood, tennis is becoming really big. And so, doubles, and it's all day, every day. And sometimes in the terms, I think of like conflict in marriage in terms of tennis. Imagine marriage as you and your partner standing apart from each other, hitting, nice balls back and forth to each other, but one gets a little bit upset and puts a little spice on it, and the other one says, oh, this is what we're doing, and returns it even with a little more spice, and back and forth, and eventually they're at the net pounding the ball at each other as hard as they can. A better strategy for that is the partner to just let it go and to reserve. And Proverbs is saying that's what a wise man does. Just overlook it. Don't let it keep building. And so if people feel that they want conflict, they're probably already in sin. Like if they're looking forward to that conflict, they're already in a place where they've already premeditated or had imaginary conversations in their head of how they want this to go or how this proceed. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the point I wanted to start with, is just that Christ, we got to overlook a lot. There's got to be hills that we don't die on every hill, that not everything is that important, or else nothing's important.
Yeah, and that's the deceit of sin's effect upon our flesh, is that it's so deceptive that people can use negative conflict and like what you're describing, but they can use it trying to get, let's say, what they're wanting, like positive attention.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
The flesh is so corruptive that we can use like inordinate ways of seeking something that is maybe valuable, but wrongly. And so
wrong behavior to get
so people are
attention.
looking for conflict, because in looking for conflict, I'm getting because what did you say it said here? Idolatry.
Of course.
The idol of I want to be seen.
Yes.
I want to be heard. I want to be known. But that has become such an idol that the way they're going to do it is destructive to themselves
and to others.
But
I got to speak up.
The kingdom of God.
You can't go on your page and write what you want without me having to respond to it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the sentiment, though. It's that I feel like like even pastors, I'm not responsible for pastoring the internet.
I'm not.
And at the same time, if I post on the internet, there could be a million different responses.
Oh, without a doubt.
Right?
Without
and so
a doubt.
then that can spark, in that sense, this idolatry again. Hey, I've got to get the last word. I got to make sure people know my point of view, my vantage point, all of that.
Correct.
So
and I thought it was timely. I don't know if you saw one of my Instagram posts, I reposted today, but it said that one of the fast food chains tried to tackle McDonald's. This was in the 80s. So out in front, because the McDonald's had the quarter pounder hamburger, and so they did a promo where they did a third pound hamburger for the same price or less. And it was a total disaster, because the majority of people thought that a fourth pound
was heavier,
was more than a third pound. And then the post said, that's why I refuse to argue with people on the internet. Because if you got people thinking
a fourth and a third,
correct, then how much more is people through their own idolatry just
blind?
Yeah.
So second one is so first one, Christ confrontation overlooks a lot. Second one, Pastor Chad, Christ-like confrontation is gentle. So the one verse here I was going to read, Galatians 6:1, it says, if a person's overtaken in a fault, restore them gently. And what does gently mean? It means lovingly. It means respectfully. It's not selfishly. And Pastor Chad, here's a litmus test. Are you excited to confront them? Because if so, sometimes we are in sin. That's not really gentle. Meaning, when we confront one another, and I know a lot of times in my context, Pastor Chad, that feels like marriage because I'm in a relationship with young kids and the possibility and potentiality of conflict in the marriage relationship. So I was just going to offer today some practical tips of conflict. One of those being, and this works both in marriage, this works with your kids, this also works in the workplace, okay? When you as a leader are confronting someone, it's important, I think, for us to use I language about our feelings rather than you language about their actions. So rather than going to your spouse and saying, you hurt me, you can say, I was hurt. Or instead of saying, you're never at home, you could say, I want to spend more time with you. If you change that phrase, you now no longer trigger comparison in their heart, which causes self-defense. So if my wife says to me, you're never here on Friday nights, you know what I'm going to do? I'm not even going to talk to her about whether I'm there on Friday nights or not, because she's just triggered in me based off of your language for me to fight back and say, would you want me to get the calendar out and show you on Friday nights? If she comes to me and says, hey, I would like more time with you on Friday nights, she went, my feelings, not you and your actions. So she internalized rather than judging me. That sense of confrontation has made that whole conversation fruitful. So that's not just in marriage. That's a practical tip in the workplace. Rather than going, you did this, say, I, based on my estimation, would like for you to be more available in this context. Well, then that gives that person a chance to be able to make their own judgment on their actions rather than you having some sense of judgment. So that's one thing. Another one I thought of, Pastor Chad, is avoid the superlatives, which is the nevers, the absolutes.
Yeah, I mean, I do
always.
I do it. My response now, because I'm somewhere in my 40s, and I've heard never a lot in different moments, is I'll tell someone, look, I'm willing to engage in this conversation, and I'm willing to acknowledge or deal with any wrongs or what I've done. But if you're going to continue to use language like that, that's emotional and not based on reality, then I'm not going to engage in this moment.
Yeah.
And I just say it like that. So I'm not controlling you.
Yeah.
You determine if you want us to move this conversation forward towards peaceableness, or if you're going to stay in that type of. I cannot help us move this thing forward if that's the type of language and emotional world that I'm going to be dealing with. It's going to be a lose-lose. I just say it up front in that sense.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's not gentle. It's not gentle to use superlative language. It's not gentle to use never language. It's number one, it's something fundamentally wrong with it because there's usually error to it. There's no truth in it.
Right. It's not based in reality.
Right. But at the same time, it's not gentle. It's not. So I think that's a good. Here's another practical tip, Pastor Chad. When dealing with conflict, attack the problem, not the person. So, meaning gentle confrontations done with respect. So I'm bad at this, confession. For every one statement that's about the wrong, I probably need to make 5 describing what's right. I don't do this well with my kids. So if a conflict arises with my kids, I'm very quick to point out the things that I want them to grow, and I do it repeatedly before I often praise. And boy, it's different doing it with my son, conflict management, than even an 11-year-old girl. That's 2 totally different conversations. But if I can attack the problem, not the person, so there's no room for name calling, there's no room for sarcasm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I grew up in environments, honestly, Pastor Chad, with authority where there was no healthy conflict management because someone's always being sarcastic. Like, we can't be rooted in just genuine conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big one. The other one I put is we have to solve one problem at a time.
Yeah, it's a must.
Right. If you're talking about that
and I
issue,
do the same thing that I said earlier before, as I say, if they mention something else, I say, that might be right, it might be true, and I might need to acknowledge a wrong in that area, but I need you to choose. Do you want the conversation to deal with that or what we started on? Because I cannot address both
Yeah.
and just get anywhere. So either we stick with the thing that we originally were talking about, or we can forego that and deal with this, but we can't get into everything.
Yeah.
I don't have the capacity to speak to, 5 different things I'm supposedly wronged you at the same time.
Yeah, it's
I can't
piling
do
on.
it. Yeah,
It's piling
I
on.
can't do it.
Yeah.
It's unfair.
Yeah.
So that would be like someone going to court and having to deal with 6 cases at once. That's not how justice works.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a former president that's got multiple cases going on, but they're separate cases in separate courts.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
The last one I put there, practical, is just avoid confronting that person in public. I know it probably doesn't need to be said, but boy, it happens. And what I mean by that is, especially in the marriage relationship, you want to get a husband or wife to shut down, you confront them in public.
Yeah, it's not. It's not
going to work,
good.
right? And so when the disagreement gets to the point of confrontation, that should be reserved for private spaces. And goodness gracious, we could talk so long about this episode, like the unhealthy conflict management when someone within your organization needs to be addressed, but you have a passive aggressive leader that uses language to address the whole group while just trying to speak to one person. Right. So meaning they're blanket statements, sending it to everybody in the organization when all they need to do is just have a one-on-one meeting with the one person that's consistently doing wrong or not meeting the standard of expectation. And so I just wanted to kind of hit that one. Is Christ-like confrontation's gentle? And I was going to prove that
the scripture there before we move on,
Yeah.
of that context, Galatians 6:1, the root of where the gentleness comes from. It says there, considering yourself, and that goes back to what I was saying in the James 4, is that when you understand how Scripture defines flesh, and that we all have flesh, and there's a song right now on the radio or something that says, I've been David before, I've been Bathsheba before, and he names these. And he's saying in different moments, it's been my flesh.
I have a solidarity with all these.
Yes. Because in the flesh side of our humanity. And that's what it's saying. It said, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. And so the gentleness comes from is when you're of a sound, holistic understanding of yourself, when you address the problem, you realize that could be you, right? And so you're not necessarily coming in such a judgmental way of not realizing that we also at times have failed.
Yeah. So last illustration I was going to give with this, Pastor Chad, in Matthew 21, this is pretty fascinating. Right after Jesus' most expressive time of anger, the most vulnerable people, which are the lame and the blind, felt safe to approach him. And then it just hit me. Then in the fiercest confrontation Jesus has, there's still a spirit of gentleness that those that are vulnerable, which is the lame and the blind, still approach him. Like they're still coming close to him. So whatever we think we know of Christ-like confrontation, there's a spirit of gentleness that equips his life. And I think that's important for us to recognize. The next one is Christ-like confrontation listens twice as much as it talks. So James 1:19, be slow to speak, quick to hear, quick to forgive, right? Slow to anger. Proverbs 18:13, Pastor Chad, he who gives an answer before he hears, it's a folly and shame, right? The vast majority of communication problems are not expression problems, they're listening problems. So if we're going to be good conflict solvers in our organizations and in our leadership, we're going to have to become better servant listeners. And the best way I can say that is we have to seek to understand rather than be understood. So if I'm a leader in a context, I'm not going in constantly just trying to be understood. I am seeking and serving those that I'm serving to understand where they're coming from, which requires me to be a better listener, not interrupting people, taking turns, making sure they have a chance to express themselves fully. Because when I interrupt somebody in conflict management, I'm essentially saying my thoughts are more important than your thoughts. And so James says, be quick to listen, but he doesn't say listen in a hurry. Meaning, if you don't know what to say, ask questions. If you still don't know what to say, ask more questions. If you still don't know what to say after that, just repeat what the other person has said back to them. Because a lot of times, I want to get so practical here in conflict management. A lot of times, what the person wants from you is for you to see and hear them. So even if you don't know what to say, asking them questions or even repeating back to them what they're saying will solve the problem without you having to actually give a solution to the problem. And I did not learn this in my marriage. Okay, I did not learn this in my marriage. I wish I did, but I'm a talker, and so I have been very guilty in seasons of my life of giving premature advice. Okay, and when I do that, what the person normally is looking for is a companion in their pain, not a solution to their problem. And I failed in this miserably in the conflict management of marriage because it was always about me. I'm a go-getter, solve the problem. And oftentimes it's just about a solidarity to listen to the issue, be a good servant listener, and affirm them with some empathy of what's taking place. But there's nothing worse. There's nothing worse. In my job, Pastor Chad, this last week, I got rolled. First time I got rolled, meaning I quoted. I probably spent 30-plus hours of work. And I should have listened to my gut, because when I met with the deacon, I would talk to him about the policy he had, and I would hear him say, yep, and he wasn't really listening to me. And so then when it came time for me to give the proposal, I'm $500 more than another policy that is way worse, and he will not listen, that he has actual cash value on his roof. I'm giving replacement costs. If you lose your roof, you're going to get $2,000. We're giving you $50,000. That's worth the $500, but he would not listen. And it was like literally looking at someone, and I should have known in my intuition, there's no way this guy is going to make a wise decision because he won't listen. And then it hit me, am I listening well as a conflict solver? In managing conflict, do I listen to people well? And if you can't listen, you're not going to be a good problem solver. You're not going to be a manager of conflict. And I guess that's the point. I just want to say, because it's hard for us, Pastor Chad, to listen. Everybody in a digital mad world where everyone can publish their own thoughts and everyone can post whatever they want, it's hard to be listeners. So let's talk a bit about that. How does Christ-like confrontation listen twice as much as it talks? How have you seen that play out, maybe in your life or leadership?
Well, without it's sort of like without knowing what sport you're playing, you don't know what equipment you need to be successful. And so for me, if I don't know what we're drawing a circle around, like if I don't know what are we actually dealing with, then I don't know if what I'm going to say is even applicable. Right?
Yeah.
As leaders, we can always say something. I can come up with something to say, but it's hard for me to know if I have not drawn a circle around what is the issue we're actually dealing with, how to have words of the wise that's like a goad, that's like a well-driven nail.
That's right.
Well, the only way, if someone comes to me with conflict, that I'm going to even know, what are we talking about? Like, are we on Mars? Are we on the Earth? Like, what sphere of are we on? Is to first listen, right? And so it is what James is trying to help us with. He's saying, look, it's not our fleshly inclination when there's conflict to first listen. It's to resolve it.
Yes.
And as leaders, we know how to resolve stuff. That's what we get normally invited or paid to do, resolve issues. But he's saying there's times that for what God wants to be produced in this, which he talks about righteousness over on, right before the James 4, the fruit of righteousness, in order for it to be produced, you got to first listen, right? And so, yeah, that's why God gave us 2 ears, 1 mouth, right? Is that, studies have shown now, especially in the insurance world on the health side, that, doctors that never get liability and lawsuits, their average time spent with the patient, right, is more than those who get sued.
100%.
And
They're
those
listeners
that just come in and prescribe without listening, the legality, they're way more vulnerable. And so now, because it actually affects the bottom line, you actually have training now telling doctors
how to listen.
And the pressure, look, go in there and listen and give them a minute or two, because on the back end, it's going to be better for you and for the organization. And
so I saw my doctor just recently. I told her this story because I read the article. And in America, it was the average doctor listens only for 25 seconds before they interrupt.
Yeah.
So 25 seconds of trying to listen to this complex human being and their physical issues. we're bad listeners. That's the point I'm trying to get, is that if we're going to be good conflict managers, we got to be better listeners, all of us.
Which again, this is why it's so complex and there's so much work that the Spirit of God has to do in all of us individually. But if we're driven by a need to have to say something, then we're already in a posture of life to not listen.
Exactly.
Because there's this need that if I can just say something, then I can fix or solve it. And what sets some of us up for failure in the future is that in the past that worked. We've dealt with low-level conflict or low-level situations or people where
that lacked leadership
or lacked character. And so anything we said was always above where they were at, and it worked. But as you grow and then you get around other leaders and you get around more, complex context organizations, that thing where it just worked easy in the beginning is no longer the playing field. And so if there's still that drive, well, just let me speak because I know how to solve it and we can move on, there's going to be complexity and issues that happen where that's not going to work. And I think that's what James is saying. It's sort of like, hey, start with the posture of let me first listen.
Yes.
Be slow to speak. He who answers a matter before he thoroughly hears and understands right is folly, and a matter seems right to the person who first says it until the next comes and examines it. And so there's got to be, and I think part of having inward peace helps us to be in a posture that we're willing to listen because we're not inwardly, wrestling with some idolatry or something, some desire in our members. And I was reading today, and it's more of like a prophetic understanding, but I was reading in Acts and how Peter on the day of Pentecost, he quotes about David. Okay, and he makes this amazing thing, and it stood out to me, and maybe because I was preparing as well for this moment, this recording, but he talks about that he set the Lord always before him. So he's seeing Jesus, and we're talking about Jesus as wisdom and conflict management and character. And then it says, though, my heart rejoiced, my tongue was glad, so my flesh rested. And I thought about how when I'm not seeing the Lord clearly, right, my heart is not rejoicing, my tongue's not glad, my heart is discontent.
My flesh is constantly fighting for itself.
And now that ends at the James 4.
Yes.
Now these desires are starting to be
100%.
stirred because my flesh
100%.
is overactive and not at rest.
And you can feel that. If you're at peace internally, you have Christ formed in you. When you get around someone who is as such, you can sense that in them very quickly.
Oh.
Right? And there's nothing worse than to be led, or in an organization, a boss or whatever, manager who lives that way. Right? That's a challenge.
It's sort of, yes. It's one thing, one aspect of that is the goalposts are constantly moving, right?
Yeah.
You don't know from one week to the next what's going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the next one I put is Christ-like confrontation owns its own part of the problem. So meaning when you become aware of any way you were wrong, even how your idolatries contributed to that problem, we have to apologize for it without qualification. If you say, I'm sorry, but, then you aren't apologizing, right? Real apologies don't move from I'm sorry, but go from I'm sorry to how can I make it better or how can I improve, right? We don't give justification for what we did. And don't say you are the one who made me do this. No, the other person's guilty of their own sin and will answer to God for it, but I'm in charge of my own reaction. And this is the reason, Pastor Chad, why we all need outside counsel in our life. That's the point I wanted to make here, is because other people can help us see our own sin when our own emotions have clouded our vision. And our emotions cloud our vision really quickly. Because we're always going to see ourselves at 100% not at fault, right? And in our own frustration. But it's important to own my own part of the problem. And it's a beautiful thing if you have a leader in your life who's able to come to you, or you're able to approach them, and you were to bring up a fault or a challenge or a difficulty, a conflict, a tension moment, and they're able to hear you and then also say back to you, well, I own my part of that problem, but are you able to own your part of the problem? Well, there's a sense of justification, or a sense of, I won't say justification, there's a sense of resolve to that. I feel heard.
Yeah.
Right? I feel there was a sense of solution. I realized this leader's approachable.
Yeah.
They're accessible. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful
It
thing.
is, and that's where, for some people listening, it's not that people in your life are unwilling to acknowledge where they've sinned or been wrong, but if you don't grow individually in your ability to wisely communicate your experience, you're not able to get the person to the place to recognize or see what you're talking about, like clearly focus in on the wrong where
Yeah.
they would admit it.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is sometimes people think that the people they're doing life with, it's that they're so prideful or
They're not willing to admit it.
right. And sometimes it's that my inability to communicate well and not use the nevers,
Yes,
and
not
not
the
be so
absolutes.
emotional to them. It's not that they're unwilling, it's that I need to grow in how to approach them. I've seen that at times
Yeah.
as well.
And so I guess I wasn't going to say this, but that's where admittance needs to be specific, right? We need to be specific in language.
Yeah.
So even on the apologies, it's not I'm just sorry. It's just I'm sorry for, and be clear.
Yeah.
And the more that we can be specific, then we can understand what it is that needs to be changed.
Correct. And I
right.
think that's why James, the whole chapter before 4, deals with the tongue.
Mm-hmm.
And he connects the tongue to maturity because of how hard it is to control the tongue. And what I'm saying is
because the posture of humility will do more to diffuse conflict than just about anything else, right?
Yeah,
So
I mean,
if there's a personal sense of posture of humility, right, that I'm not perfect, that diffuses more conflict probably than anything we could ever even bring to the table.
yeah,
So
yeah. I mean, because taming the tongue, right, on our own is impossible. So growing in the character of Christ to communicate well is going to help us greatly once you get over to the James 4 on how to resolve the strife and the difficulties and deal with the desires that stem from our flesh at times, and
yep.
so
Next one I'd put here, Pastor Chad, is Christ-like confrontation's quick to forgive. It's quick to forgive, meaning in conflict, you and I kind of demonstrate what we believe about the gospel. So if I'm in a marriage conflict, I could say to the marriage partner, "What do you believe about the gospel?" And they could give me words. Or a true better litmus test would be, what do they believe about the gospel being shown in the conflict? Like the core of Christianity, and this is the point I was trying to get at, is the core of Christianity is like being overwhelmed by the forgiveness of the gospel, realizing I have sinned against God way more than I've ever sinned against someone else. And the forgiveness God has given me is so overwhelming that I gladly and easily forgive others. But when I refuse to forgive my coworker or my spouse or my whatever teammate for his or her sins, I'm in effect saying that their sin against me is worse than my sin against God, because I've not been attentional back to the forgiveness that God has granted to me. And I guess that's the point here, is I'm trying to say is that if we're going to Christ-like confrontation, it's quick to forgive. It's quick to forgive because we have been forgiven so much. John Wesley, I know John Wesley had a lot of problems, Pastor Chad, but he said discovering the gospel was like learning about a rich uncle you didn't know who had left you an inestimable fortune. And the way John Wesley said this, he said $10 billion, and as you're riding to the bank to collect it, when you get about a mile from the bank, one of your carriage wheels breaks off. They didn't have cars. And he said, "Do you swear and curse God?" He said, "You hardly notice. You skip and run the rest of your way back to the bank to collect your treasure." What's he saying? How much people's grievances against me really bother me show me how much little I'm really enraptured by the gospel and what Christ has really forgiven me. That if I know Christ has given me $1 billion, an inestimable fortune, I'm not going to complain about a simple offense that someone had towards me or someone pricked me the wrong way. So in our world, the way we would in a modern sense say that is the reason our culture is so offendable is because we are that prideful. Like the offense, my ability to be offended is in often direct relationship to how much pride I'm walking in. And I become in some sense unoffendable when I'm walking in a sense of humility and realize how much grace and mercy and forgiveness I've been given. Like when I act like, Pastor Chad, their wrong against me has ruined my world, man, I have been reconciled to God. I've been given an eternity of glorious promises, and I got to keep those things in perspective. So
Yeah,
I
well,
guess
yeah. Well, just on that note, that's why when Jesus taught his disciples in his discipleship process on forgiveness, um, he set the whole matter on the issue of faith. And biblical faith is relational trust.
Yeah.
And so, meaning it's very hard to forgive if you don't have relational trust that God is bigger than the offense and what's happened in the world.
exactly, and then justice
Right.
done against you.
Right.
Yes.
And so faith is the key that helps us be empowered to live out that new nature of forgiveness, because we're saying that God is bigger than what man or even the devil through man has done. And therefore I can trust him in this. And because I can trust him in this, I can release that debt. And so going back and asking the Holy Spirit to help us see Jesus clearly helps create that faith and in our relational trust that we can overlook, we can forgive, because God is bigger than it. And also, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking is that so often, I think the reason Scripture highlights that we're to be lovers of the truth is that being a lover for truth and reality helps us when it comes to be willing to own our sin. Because it's not that God hasn't provided holy blood for the sinner to forgive them. It's they're unwilling to acknowledge truthfulness, that they're a sinner in need of forgiveness. And for me, when I have found someone is a lover of truth, and once truth has been clear and they see the truth and acknowledge the truth that they did sin against me or another, and they're willing to own that truth, it like really frees me. It makes it so much easier to forgive. Because what we're asking for is we're just wanting someone to acknowledge the truth. The problem is where conflicts get stuck is when you're dealing with two people and their view of reality,
The perception of what happened
is not the same.
Yes.
That's where it takes great wisdom, and oftentimes it takes outside mediation to try to get actual reality.
Yes.
For truth to prevail. Because my experience is my experience, but my experience is not reality
Yes.
always, right?
Always,
It's
no.
my interpretation of it.
Yes.
And so, but ultimate truth, God's truth, is truth regardless of my interpretation or experience of it. And we
And-
serve a God of truth, and so he wants that truth to come.
Yeah. Sometimes people don't want to forgive because they feel like forgiving somehow minimizes the other person's sins,
Certainly.
or they're doing a disservice to themselves or betraying their own heart. And the thing I always say is good news for you. Psalm 56:8 says God holds every one of our tears in his capable hands.
Yeah.
So this is what I always say is forgiving someone is not doing a disservice to you or the accused. It's just magnifying God's grace. Listen, Pastor Chad, I've never had this happen. 2 weeks ago, I had a TikTok go viral, and right now it's like 250,000 views with 1,000 inboxes. People have inboxed me,
Responded.
and those inboxes have been, oh my gosh, I cannot imagine. You can't imagine the pain. And people, I cannot imagine. I am floored at how open people are with strangers. Shows you how disconnected we are culturally, of just saying, this is what this person did to me. I mean, it is unbelievable. I go back to my pastoring the internet. I can't pastor the internet, and nor am I responsible. But it was just mind-boggling to me to say somebody could take a 90-second clip and they're in such pain about this issue of conflict and lack of forgiveness and extending forgiveness. They're holding on to this overwhelming decades of bitterness, saying there's no way. If I forgive that person, they'll never know that I was in this much pain. And they're living in these deception and lies. And I'm like, listen, forgiveness is not doing a disservice to you or the accused.
Of course not.
Forgiveness is magnifying God's grace.
Yeah.
Right? That's hard for people to see, especially if they have no, obviously, gospel mindset. And I'm sure majority of people that I'm talking to on TikTok don't.
Yeah, I don't know how you get past it other than you just get tired of being miserable as an unbeliever to say, I got to move on. But yeah, I mean, I get it if you're an unbeliever.
Yes.
because it's it's relating to God and His nature that teaches us His nature of forgiving.
Yeah.
Um,
Last one I had here, Pastor Chad, is Christ-like confrontation is wise and patient in the timing of the confrontation. Wise and patient. So Proverbs 12:18 says, "There's one whose rash words are like a sword,
mm-hmm.
but the tongue of the wise bring healings." Now, what rash words just means words spoken in anger. But it can also mean, and I didn't know this, at least my Hebrew commentary said words spoken at the wrong time. Rash words.
Yeah.
Meaning, you quoted earlier, Proverbs 25:11, like apples of gold and settings of silver is a word spoken in a right circumstance.
Well, yeah, and I was talking about the end of Ecclesiastes.
Oh, I got you.
Yeah.
But that gentle Christ-like confrontation is sensitive to timing.
Yes.
Meaning I can't just approach it when I want to approach it, right?
No.
If I'm going to be a conflict manager.
Yeah, I mean, doctors don't approach patients just whenever they want.
Yeah,
There's a right context for the doctor to seek to bring healing, right?
right.
And again, that goes back to the James 4, because my flesh at times says, well, I want to deal with it now, and I want it
Yeah.
resolved now, and I want to move on now. Well, unfortunately, I'm not God of the other person in the conflict. I'm not God of how circumstances sometimes creates a delay.
Yes.
And so it is, of course, hard for us at times to surrender.
Yes.
But when we do, James 4 goes on to say God gives grace. He gives His strength and empowerment to the humble, those that's in the posture. And I would just say, obviously, we could stir up a lot, or are stirring up a lot potentially in your heart regarding things you're facing or have faced. And I would say that, this is a deep topic, and we would always refer you for long-term study and receive from any John Townsend and Henry Cloud book. They have exceptional books on how to have hard conversations, boundaries, with leaders, all types of things on
Interpersonal conflict.
these situations. So we don't want to stir this up and then leave you, but that is something that we would resource you with and direct you to, of biblical, Christ-centered, practical, in-depth working through this issue.
And I know I don't want to sound elementary in this, but and I don't want to assume that you don't know this, but I can't assume that in today's world, is that in dealing with these conflicts, you want to go face to face. So this is never text, this is never email, this is never Snapchatting a conflict. Listen, friends,
and one of the reasons, I'm going to tell you, I'm not on Facebook, okay? And I am on Instagram mainly because of resources that we do to provide the body of Christ and serve others. But that's one of the reasons I got off, is because of, as a leader and impacting people, it was so easy for them to message or want to address or talk about something that way. And we're already more accessible in our context than many leaders in other contexts we've experienced.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But my point is, I just got off of it because I wasn't going to continue to give into the way this culture just easily thinks that that's how you deal with such difficult things.
Pastor Chad, I'm not joking when I say this. I know countless, we could say scores of lives and relationships that have been ruined by indiscriminate emails, inboxes, DMs, direct messages. Literally, I know hundreds. I know challenges. I met with a marriage today off an indiscriminate text, and how that indiscriminate
How are you
text,
using that word? What are you saying about that? Indiscriminate.
Me making a judgment off of some type of
Post or something.
or engagement, interpretation.
And then it leads to a rift in the relationship.
Yes, and then they want to address it via that same medium rather than in person.
I got you.
And the enemy. So I've been so
havoc.
tired. We've gotten on this podcast multiple times, and I've said it in settings. And so this week I got upset with myself, and I said, I'm going to go look, because I keep hearing it. I was actually on a podcast last week with a lady in our church, and it got brought up again. So I went and looked in Harvard. This is Harvard. In an emotional conversation, 7% of what you believe about communication is relayed through content, 38% is through facial expression, and 55% through body language. So if I take out body language and facial expression, I'm down to 7% accuracy. Crazy. So via text, DMing, emails.
Especially if you get a text from me, because I don't like text and it's just straight to the point. And my fat thumbs, half the times the words are misspelled. I mean, you got to have the gift of interpretation of tongues, and he'll testify to that.
So that's what I'm trying to say. And I know there's a little bit of humor there, but think about that.
That's
Think
wild.
about that. If 7% of my emotional conversation is relayed through content, then that means if I don't get in the presence of other individuals to deal with emotionally charged things, the devil's going to have a heyday with us. An absolute heyday. And that's not a good example for conflict management. So I know I don't want to make this dumb. I don't want to undermine or think, oh, well, you don't understand that. But it needs to be addressed in the podcast, because I still deal with people on a week-to-week basis that think that you can deal with emotionally charged conflict via other mediums other than face-to-face. And it's just not. Even if you can hop on Zoom. I mean, some people, maybe you work with people that you're not with physically. That's okay. You can hop on Zoom. There's other mediums to be able to read body language and read facial expression. But I have made it a point in dealing with emotionally charged stuff as it relates to my pastoral leadership. I'm just not going to entertain it at all on the phone. And I'm not going to entertain it through any medium other than being able to get in your presence and speak to it. So my last part, Pastor Chad, is that Christ-like confrontation, just it's filled with gospel hope. So for many people, Pastor Chad, and maybe you can finish with this, is that conflict spirals downward because there's this overtone of despair. It's like, oh my God, this relationship's never going to work. You're too broken. I'm too broken. And I just want to say, friend, through the cross, I know he can cleanse every sin, and through the power of the resurrection, God can restore anything that's been broken, any relationship. And that hope has gotten many people through a lot of difficult time. It's the power of hope. There's a legendary experiment, Pastor Chad, in which a researcher was trying to determine how long a rat could make it without drowning. And they found out if you throw the rat in the water, they would drown before 10 minutes. But if you took them out 2 or 3 times and put them back in, the rats developed this sense of hope, and some of them could swim for 60 hours, changing no factor except the introduction of hope that they are going to get.
Is that what God's doing with me in some situation of difficulty, trying to get my hope meter growing?
He is. There's one factor that if we could introduce it into our marriages and our workplaces, that would do more to strengthen than anything else, and that's hope.
Oh, yeah. I mean, hope
It's hope.
is dangerously powerful.
And what does hope come from? Knowing that God has a plan for this relationship. Like I honestly, I honestly believe a lot of marriages, they feel so down because they don't know God has a plan for their home and testimony for their and when you live in relationship, covenant relationship, and you're not on a common mission together and have a hope that God has a purpose for this marriage, well, that's really dark. It's going to brim with a lot of disappointment.
Definitely. And there comes a point where then, some have hoped so long that it's easy for them to give up. But what they're realizing potentially, or need to realize, it's not that God still doesn't have good plans for them, is that they're playing with the wrong tools. They're trying to use the wrong tools to move it forward. And that's where good, godly counsel can help, and resources to say, oh, I've been trying to play baseball, but the whole time we've actually been on the tennis court.
Yeah, absolutely.
On this issue. So,
well, let's end, Pastor Chad, maybe just looking a word of hope or encouragement to those that are watching or listening today. And based on the relationship of trust and forgiveness, what are the byproducts of being unwilling to grant forgiveness? Like, what's it going to do?
It's major.
What's it going to do to your health, your anxiety, your blood pressure, your depression, your immune system? Like,
yeah, I mean, you're talking, it has spirit, soul, and body negative implications scripturally, and through research demonstrated of science. But holding on to unforgiveness is put up there as one of the most dangerous things. It is forgivable, so it's not as dangerous as the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, or someone that just don't care about truth at all. But it's so dangerous because Jesus said that it puts us in a posture where the grace of God can no longer flow fresh into our life.
It's a blockade of channel.
And so there is no growth there is no transformation, there is no Christ-like character being developed in our life apart from the grace of God. So now you're not just a stagnant believer when you hold on to unforgiveness, bitterness, but you are moving away from the very direction of the gospel and Christ-likeness.
Because when we don't forgive, we rehearse the offense. And repetition is the key to memory.
That's right.
So if you repeat,
and then
repeat,
the inward
repeat.
world
Yes.
begins to dictate the outward world of behaviors and direction that our feet take and actions and things like that. So it is major. It's, one of the things it says it can cause us to fall short of where the grace of God could have carried and took us in our race of following Jesus. Major implications. And a great book is The Bait of Satan, of John Bevere, that God has used to help expose the dangers of unforgiveness. I used to read it once a year. Probably need to read it again this year, but because it's a common thing in a world. Jesus made it very clear: offenses are going to come. Now, woe to who they come through.
Yeah.
Okay, but offenses are going to come. So there's something in the age we live in that's not going away. And so I need to, if I want to grow in Christ-likeness, learn his weapons and tools to deal with it. And so it's an ongoing reality that we face.
Well, last thing I'm going to say to you, if you're listening today and you're a leader trying to resolve conflict and you and that person are in trouble, what would some wise next steps be? So I just jotted down in my notes. Number one, don't hurt alone. So talk to a friend or a pastor now. So what I mean by that is kind of bad is more than enough to at least start talking to a mutually trusted friend. So it's kind of bad in our relationship. If you're already saying it's kind of bad, well, that's a good opportunity for you to talk to somebody, because listen to me, this is so key. Isolation is a microphone to pain and dysfunction. So the more I pull back, the more I try to deal with it on my own. Don't wait until things get that bad. There's a barrier to taking that first step. And if you wait until things are clearly that bad, then you're in a crisis, and then you're making rushed decisions of profound consequences in a totally disrupted emotional state. So please don't do that. If you're trying to get through conflict, talk to somebody. If you're trying to deal with conflict at your workplace, talk with somebody. And we do understand that a lot of the issues that we've probably touched on tonight require counseling in a lot of ways, and that's fine if it's professional counseling that's needed in that relationship. But big picture, we're here as pastors and as leaders to try to say, what are some top leadership skills that are needed? One of the key leadership skills is how to manage conflict. And so hopefully these have been some pretty helpful things of how to do it in a way that's Christ-like, and as we learn from Scripture. Any final thoughts, Pastor Chad?
Yeah, just in that, don't isolate.
Yeah.
Find someone to talk to. And yet, in the motive of talking to them, you're not looking for someone that absolutely agrees with your diagnostic of the situation. You just need someone that understands what you're saying is your diagnostic of the situation. I have found that I don't need someone to agree with me, but if I can find someone that at least understands my interpretation of reality, it really helps my heart get back to that place of letting go and entering back in relational trust to God on that issue.
Yeah.
Because now I at least know I've been hurt.
Yeah, of course.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
They understand where I'm at. I don't need you to agree with me, but I
that-
do want to feel understood.
Yes, Christ-like confrontation is gentle. That's what I feel. It listens twice as more than it talks, and I think that's key. So that's our hope, friends. Our hope is that this serves you. So to continue on the conversation, we'll be back really soon with episode 3. We're going to continue to go through
Season
8
4.
of these leadership competencies, skills that are needed in our life and leadership. So remember, in order to lead, you must first be led. That matters. If you're new to the podcast, go back and listen to the previous episodes.
Yeah, we got hours of content for
We
you.
got 3 seasons of 8 episodes each, so that's 24, and now 25. So this is episode 26.
Hit a like,
Yeah.
smash, subscribe.
Hit the bell icon, if you will. Stay up to date, and again, always feel free to reach out if you have any questions or content or want to share, and we look forward to being back with you next time for Let Talk with Rex.